This is Fothentic History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Brian Young.
And, Brian, did you know that at one point the galaxy was actually filled with astonishing animals that lived with sentient life forms as livestock and work animals and predators and pests and pets?
Is that no longer the case?
Well, presumably, but they aren't all still with us.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time when the galactic worlds, there was travel among them, and the vast and disparate planets that were happening, and the landscapes of each individual planet that were all inhabited meant that the fauna of that galaxy was just as varied, and each species and subspecies had to acclimate to its own unique habitat.
Unfortunately, many of the creatures that were common in various environments have vanished, and we have only a few notes about them. But even so, biologists and historians alike have done a great deal of research to try to catalog and analyze as many as possible.
And that's an ongoing task, so keep in mind that while we're working from the available research that exists as we record this, there is always the possibility that some new discovery will completely change everything we know about any of these creatures from the galaxy's long history.
Today, we're going to talk about 5 galactic animals, so you'll get a little info on some that were domesticated, some that were very much not, land creatures, sea creatures, and one that was amphibious. It's a mishmash sampling of galactic fauna.
And first, we're going to start with one of my favorites, the bantha. And banthas are also perhaps one of the most deeply researched animals that we're going to talk about today. And this is due in part to their unique and fascinating relationship with Tusken raiders, who lived alongside banthas on Tatooine and formed really deep bonds with their animals. And it's unclear when exactly the Tuskens and the banthas developed this symbiosis, but images depicting banthas appear on some of the oldest known Tusken art.
The bond between a Tusken and its bantha has been described as mystical. Truly, there's a depth of connection to the relationship that's rare between humanoids and animals. And it starts when both the Tusken and the bantha are quite young. At the age of 7, Tusken children were paired with young banthas, and each child was tasked with caring for their animal as the two grew up together and thus would begin a lifelong attachment.
So as the bantha and the child grew together, both of them would become accustomed to a rider-mount dynamic as well. And when banthas of male Tuskens reached their adulthood, and the animals took around 20 years to mature, the Tusken would ride his animal into the desert and perform a variety of traditional initiation rituals to become recognized as an adult member of the tribe.
When 2 Tuskens were betrothed to one another, their banthas also became mates for life. Often, not through any rule or manipulation, but simply because of how attuned to each other the animals and Tuskens were, bantha pairs would bear offspring around the same time as their riders.
And perhaps the most poetic and gloomy part of the relationship was the common reaction that a bantha or a Tusken would often have if their paired being were to die. So both Tuskens and banthas were actually prone to commit suicide in such situations, rather than go on living without their bonded animal or person.
But banthas were around long before Tusken clans or any humanoid beings were. Fossil remains have been found that are much older than any similar discoveries that give evidence of developed cultures. They're most often associated with Tatooine, where 3 different varieties exist: the common bantha, the dwarf bantha, and the dune bantha. But they were found on other worlds as well, though it seems likely that Tatooine was their native planet. Most cultures that would interact with banthas didn't have anything resembling the relationship the Tuskens had with the animals.
Outside of Sand People society, banthas were used as mounts and as food livestock. Bantha milk and steaks made from their flesh were particularly popular, and their hides could be tanned and used for any number of applications, from clothing to furniture.
The social structure of bantha herds was matriarchal, with one strong female both leading and protecting as many as 24 others. Males would act as sentries, sticking to the edges of the herd group to be ready for defense. As one leader would age out of her peak abilities, leadership would pass to another strong female. As herds became successful and strong, and their numbers swelled beyond a reasonable group for one leader to look after, they would divide, each new group following its own lead female.
And at birth, the average bantha weighed about 110 pounds, so that's 50 kilograms if you use metric. And it would increase in size to an average 8,800 pounds, that's about 4,000 kilograms at maturity. And as we mentioned earlier, banthas reached full maturity around 20 years, which is when they would typically begin to produce offspring.
A bantha pregnancy typically lasted more than 2 years, about 30 months. For Earth animal comparison, an elephant gestation typically lasts 18 to 22 months, varying slightly by species. Most banthas lived 80 to 100 years.
And a quick visual clue to guess a bantha's age were its horns. So each year that the bantha lived, a new segment would grow. So while young banthas would have very short horns, an aged bantha could have as many as 2 full spirals worth of growth. And those horns would be used for bashing an enemy in battle, but doing so really came at a pretty significant risk. If the animal's horns became locked, it was almost impossible to separate, dooming the enemies to die a slow death together.
So next we're going to talk about tauntauns. And that's another animal that would engage in bashing horns together. Though tauntauns did not have the high risk of interlocking that banthas did, there were at least 15 different species of tauntaun in the Galactic Republic, and they were also commonly referred to as snow lizards.
And those species included the common tauntaun, sometimes called the giant tauntaun, and then a number of species that tended to be smaller and a little bit more specialized, including the glacier tauntaun, with less fur and less bulky musculature than the common tauntaun, and the climbing tauntaun, which was the smallest known species. Climbing tauntauns could literally scale glacial walls, and they were compact with long, lean muscles. And it was not unheard of for multiple species of tauntaun to live in close proximity to one another and interact, particularly during especially harsh winters when groups would often take refuge together in caves.
Because tauntauns were native to the incredibly brutal and cold terrain of Hoth, their biology reflected the need to preserve vital processes in icy weather. They were reptomammalian, exhibiting characteristics of both lizard-like species and mammals.
And in comparison to Earth fauna, while their size was much smaller, their body balance was very similar to that of a T-Rex. So they carried themselves upright on their incredibly powerful hind legs, which ended in these clawed feet that had 3 toes, and then their front limbs were relatively small. And they also had a long tail that helped them maintain balance.
While they were furry and warm-blooded like mammals, the actual hides of tauntauns under their fur were scaly like reptiles. That thick skin provided an added layer of insulation to the blubber layer that sat between the hide and the animal's muscle tissue and vital organs. The animals had 2 sets of nostrils that allowed them to cycle and warm the air they breathed before introducing it to the lungs.
And despite the large size and power of some of the particularly larger species of tauntaun, all of them were herbivores. They survived by eating the hardy lichen and other plant life that had adapted to Hoth's icy conditions. And newborn tauntauns were actually able to forage for their own food right from birth. So the mother did not have to deal with that. They just had to sort of protect them and look after them. But mothers could, if needed, regurgitate a milk-like sustenance from these esophageal pouches that were part of their physiology if they needed to provide for their offspring.
Most tauntaun herd groups ranged in number from 20 to 30. Their primary predator was the wampa, and they were docile enough that settlers were able to use them as mounts. The downside to this setup was the really bad odor that tauntauns emitted. The secretions that created that smell incidentally would cease when the animal was asleep. And that served as a protective measure, making it more difficult for the wampa or other predators to sniff them out as they slumbered. During sleep, tauntauns would also slow their metabolisms as a means of conserving precious energy.
It's pretty common knowledge that the Rebel Alliance used tauntauns at Echo Base on Hoth, but in doing so, they inadvertently drew predatory wampas to the base as well. And there were actually several occasions on record where wampas were able to infiltrate the base's stables to make their kills. So while the tauntauns were very helpful, they came with a lot of risks.
So switching for a moment to aquatic beasts, we travel to Naboo to talk about the OPC killer. This was a truly unique species because it exhibited characteristics of both crustaceans and fish. The head and forward section of the body looked very much like a fish. They even had a lure appendage similar to those of anglerfish. The main body and end of the beast showed almost lobster-like legs, and the entire body was covered in a chitinous exoskeleton.
The OP both swam, as one would expect of a fish, and occasionally crawled on the seafloor. And the legs could actually be engaged to cling to walls of craggy sea outcroppings, but they would also be put to use for propulsion while swimming. And the exoskeleton also served as part of a propulsion mechanism, because the creature would suck in water through its mouth and then flush it out through the openings in its shell segments to thrust it forward.
Like many of the fish we observe here, the opie was a paternal mouth brooder. To begin the reproductive process, both males and females would release pheromonal bubbles into the water to attract their mates. Then paired-off opies would engage in a fin dance, which culminated in the female laying eggs.
And after the female laid her eggs, a male would fertilize them and then scoop them up and hold them in his mouth as they matured to hatching. And this oral incubation stage lasted approximately 3 months, during which the expectant father fasted, counting on his fat stores to sustain him.
One of the physiological developments which assisted in the brooding process was the opie's arrangement of teeth. They had a double ring of teeth, and for the males, that meant that the eggs could settle down in between them and be protected and safe as they incubated. When not used for brooding, that double ring of chompers was used to quickly disarm and dismember prey.
And hatched OP babies, similar to tauntaun babies, were able to sort of take care of themselves in terms of feeding immediately after emerging from their eggs. They were able to hunt right out of the gate, although they did usually stay close to the patriarch during their early life, and sometimes they would even actually swim back into his mouth for safety.
After that long brooding fast, an opie male would need immediate sustenance. One of the things that aided in rapidly replenishing nutrients was the opie's tongue, which has been estimated at 3 times the length of the animal's body. The opie's body was approximately 20 meters in length, so the tongue was about 2/3 the length of a football field.
And that lengthy tongue was actually also sticky, enabling the sea killer to extend it into schools of smaller fish and snap it back in, pulling huge numbers of prey with it.
Transitioning from an exclusively aquatic beast, but staying on Naboo, we will talk next about the amphibious Kadu.
Kadu are characterized as reptavian, so both exhibiting characteristics of reptiles and birds, but they had no wings. They had actually only 2 appendages, powerful legs, that enabled them to gallop quickly on land, and kept their bodies streamlined for diving and swimming in the water. Kadu could actually go up to 2 hours without breathing as they swam, looking for aquatic plant life and snails to eat. And they actually had billed heads that looked almost like a duck-billed platypus.
So Kadu males and females lived separately in flocks that ranged widely in size. There could be as few as 20 flocked together, as many as 100. During mating season, the male and female flocks would reunite, and the male's color would shift to offer a flamboyant display intended to attract females.
Kadu females would make nests out of mud and line them with plants, and there's actually some pretty steep discrepancies in reports about the number of eggs that a Kadu female might lay in one nest. Numbers ranging from as low as 6 all the way to the triple digits have been reported. So until additional evidence is uncovered that conclusively determines what the actual reality was, that particular detail of Kadu reproduction will remain a bit hazy.
When the infants hatched, they could immediately walk, but in the egg stage, they were extremely susceptible to danger. Another reptavian species, the peko, was a predator to unhatched Kadu and would snatch any eggs it found unattended.
Kadu were used as riding animals by the Gungans, and there was a certain degree of similarity between the Tusken-bantha relationship and the Gungan-Kadu relationship, in that Gungans would raise Kadu from their egg state, and they would bond very closely with the animals. Kadu that were used for travel were normally saddled, and they were often decorated with large feathers. They were quite beautiful.
One of the most terrifying creatures in the galaxy, both for its sheer size and for its dangerous nature, is the Sarlacc. And unfortunately, the level of danger associated with it has curtailed research about it, as field study means truly putting a researcher's life in peril.
Even so, we do know a fair amount about these largely underground creatures. And one of the most astonishing facts is how long they could live. an estimated 20,000 to 50,000 years. So that is another reason so much remains unknown about sarlaccs. Their lifespan far exceeds that of any researcher, and it's difficult to keep a study going over thousands of years for a variety of reasons.
The most commented upon historical sarlacc we know of was the one in Tatooine's Dune Sea. That's because it figured into the myth of crime lord Jabba the Hutt as a means by which he would execute enemies, and that sarlacc was almost certainly a female.
And we know this because the females of the species were the ones that would bury themselves in the sand, leaving only their mouths visible at the surface. So should a creature fall into that mouth, it was almost always a one-way trip. And this was due to the inward-pointing teeth that trapped prey, as well as a hollow beaked tongue that would suck said prey into the digestive tract.
The much smaller male would burrow under the ground and attach itself to the female as a parasite. This was a lifelong attachment. The rest of the underground body included not only the beast's massive gullet, which was surrounded by nodule-like primary digestive glands, but also multiple hearts, a large digestive stomach, and numerous tentacle-like appendages that reached out into the surrounding substrate.
And a commonly held but unverified belief about sarlaccs is that they had a unique ability to not only discern smart prey from stupid prey, but that they could also absorb the intellect of smarter prey into a sort of collective intelligence within the beast.
That sounds terrifying.
It really does.
Isn't that a little bit terrifying too, like from an existential standpoint, where it's like the longer they sit there and eat, the smarter they become, and the more they realize that that's all their life is?
Maybe, but no one's ever done a psychological study on a sarlacc to the best of my knowledge. If someone does, I will read the heck out of it.
That would be fascinating.
Indeed.
So, sarlaccs reproduced by spores, and their life cycle was truly unique. After the spores were released from the female's subdermal oviduct, they would pair up, male to female, and then make their way to the surface. From there, the lightweight proto-sarlacc would be carried ever higher into the atmosphere, eventually making its way beyond the planet's atmosphere and into space. It would drift in space, developing slowly over the course of years, and eventually, if not picked off by a predator, it would settle on a planet to grow to maturity and start the cycle of reproduction over.
That kind of blew my mind when I came across that little tidbit. It seems like a really... It would explain why there are not a lot of sarlaccs. That seems like a rough life cycle, but...
Yeah.
Of course, the sarlacc's most famous characteristic has always been slow digestion. It's the reason that Jabba used it as a punishing end for those who wronged him. So the stomach acid of this unique creature could break down whatever living thing had fallen into its maw, while simultaneously keeping that thing alive so it wouldn't decay and become inedible. And this process is rumored to have lasted anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years. It also affords the sarlacc the ability to hydrate itself by slowly absorbing the fluids from its prey over time. And for obvious reasons, we don't know if those victims were entirely conscious of what was happening, and if their intellect became part of the greater whole, we don't know if they would also retain a sense of self. But regardless, it sounds like a really awful way to go.
Truly terrifying.
I also wonder, too, like, for creatures that don't have a lifespan that is as long as 500 years, was there some sort of element chemically in the sarlacc's digestive tract that could sort of sustain their life?
Yeah, it seems like that would be, like, if they just sucked their yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and we probably never will. But you never know. Stories may emerge.
So that's it for the legendary Galactic Fauna. There were, of course, so many more, and evidence of others is being discovered all the time. So if you listeners enjoy this one, there's every likelihood that we'll have another installment in the future.
Yeah, we can do an ongoing series of Galactic Fauna if people want, because there's plenty to talk about for sure.
Yeah. So I don't have any mail this week.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of if you forwarded any to me.
No, I don't have any mail this week.
Okay.
So Holly, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Okay, I can be found at Surliest Girl on Twitter. I am also a host on Stuff You Missed in History class, which can be found at missedinhistory.com, which will connect you to all of our social media. And I also do a podcast with you about Star Wars.
Yeah, Full of Sith is a lot of fun. So if you want to listen to that, that's good times. You can find me at Swankmatron on Twitter and Patreon and just about everywhere else. And you can find out about my writing at brianyoungfiction.com and with Holly on Full of Sith. And as for Fothentic History, you can find us at our website at fothentichistory.com. And if you want to write us email, you can use the contact form on the website and send us mail that way. You can also find us on Twitter at Fothentics and on Facebook at Fothentic History. And we'd love to hear from you any way you'd like. And if you want to leave a review for the show on iTunes or wherever else you listen to the show, we'd appreciate that as well. So unless you've got anything else, Holly.
I do not.
Then that's it for this time.
Bye.